He became a top banker and dumped me. That's what everyone remembers about that night in Manhattan. But what they never saw was the moment he looked me in the eyes and said, "I finally got what I worked for, Emily, but I can't carry you with me anymore." And then he slid those divorce papers across our kitchen table like they were just another financial document, and I remember staring at them while the city lights of New York flickered behind him through the window, and I asked him, "So I was just a liability to you?" And he didn't even flinch when he said, "Don't make this emotional, this is just reality." And I felt something inside me go completely still, not broken, not loud, just silent. And then I remember him adding, almost casually, "The firm expects a certain image now, like I was something that didn't fit into his new life." And I asked him, "After everything I did for you, Daniel, after the nights I worked double shifts while you studied for your MBA, you're really saying this to my face?" And he looked away like I was already gone before I even left. And that's when I realized the man I loved wasn't leaving me because he stopped loving me. He was leaving me because he had started believing I didn't belong in the world he was trying to enter. And I remember sitting there, my hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee I never drank, while he packed a small suitcase like our entire marriage could fit into it, and he said, "You'll be okay. Emily, you always land on your feet," like I was some temporary problem he was solving, not a life he built with. And I remember whispering, "Do I even get a choice in this?" And he paused at the door for half a second, just long enough to pretend he cared. And then he said, "This is the choice," and left. And that was the night my husband became a top banker and dumped me. But the part no one talks about is how quietly it happened. No screaming, no shattered plates, just a signature, a silence, and a man who had already decided I no longer counted. And if this story is reaching you wherever you are in the world, only if it truly speaks to your heart, I would be grateful if you could like this video and subscribe. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from, your city, your country, and what time it is right now where you are. Because sometimes it feels like stories like this only exist until someone else confirms they felt it too. And my name is Emily Carter. I am 29 years old, and that night in Manhattan didn't just end my marriage, it ended the version of myself that believed love and loyalty always grew in the same direction, and I didn't know it then. But what happened in that kitchen was not the ending of my story. It was the beginning of something I still didn't have a name for. And I remember after he left, the apartment felt too large, like the walls had moved away from me, and the silence kept pressing in until I couldn't tell if I was still standing or just remembering how to stand. And I was about to turn off the kitchen light when my phone vibrated on the counter once, then again. And I saw a message from an unknown number. No name, just a single line that said, "Don't believe what he told you, not about you and not about what he's building." And I remember freezing because Daniel had already left the building, but somehow, it felt like something else had just walked into my life, something he never warned me about. The message stayed on my screen longer than it should have, just 4 words on a black background glowing in the quiet of my kitchen, and I remember standing there barefoot on the cold tile, staring at it like it might change if I blinked hard enough. "Do not believe him," and I whispered it out loud without realizing. Believe what? And the apartment was empty except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of New York traffic rising like a wave outside the window. And for a moment I thought maybe it was a mistake, maybe someone had sent it to the wrong Emily. But then I saw another message appear. No introduction, no name, just, "You do not know what he built to get here." And that was when something inside me tightened. Not fear exactly, but recognition. Like a door I had kept locked for years was suddenly being pressed from the other side. And I sat down slowly at the edge of the couch, because my legs did not feel entirely mine anymore. And I thought about Daniel, about how he used to talk in numbers even when we were dating, about risk and return and exposure, and how he would smile like the world was a problem he already knew how to solve. But there was something I had always ignored, something small but persistent, the way he never fully explained where the early money came from, or why certain conversations stopped when I walked into the room. And I remember one night, years ago, back when we were still just trying to survive Manhattan rent and cheap takeout dinners, I asked him, "Do you ever feel like we are building something together, or are we just waiting for your life to start?" And he laughed softly, kissed my forehead and said, "Emily, you are my anchor, do not overthink." And I believed him because that is what people do when they love someone who sounds certain. But now, sitting alone in that silence, I realized certainty is not the same thing as truth. And I opened my laptop without thinking, my fingers moving before my thoughts caught up, typing his name into search results, into financial forums, into articles I had never cared to read before, and what I found was nothing dramatic at first, just polished headlines, promotions, interviews, words like aggressive strategy, rapid ascent, Wall Street standout. But between those lines, I started noticing gaps, companies that appeared and disappeared from his history, roles that overlapped in ways that did not quite align, and I remember leaning closer to the screen, my breath slowing, as if I was afraid the internet itself might hear me, and then my phone buzzed again, this time a different number, and I hesitated before answering, pressing it to my ear and saying nothing, and a woman's voice came through, calm but heavy with something unspoken. "Emily Carter," she said, like she already knew me. And I answered quietly, "Yes." And there was a pause on the other end, long enough that I almost thought the call had dropped, before she continued, "I do not have much time, and I should not be calling you, but you deserve to know that what he told you about your marriage ending was only the surface." And I felt my throat tighten because she did not sound like a stranger guessing. She sounded like someone who had been carrying this longer than I had been living it, and I asked, "Who are you?" And she exhaled softly, like she had been waiting for that question, and said, "Someone who used to sit in the same meetings as him before he moved up." And I looked back at the empty apartment, at the space where Daniel used to leave his briefcase by the door, always perfectly aligned like everything else in his life, and I asked her, "Why are you telling me this?" And she said something that made my stomach sink in a way I did not fully understand yet, because the version of him that left you was already being replaced long before that night. And I closed my eyes for a second, not because I was tired, but because I could suddenly feel how far back the ground beneath my life might have already started to shift. And when I opened them again, the message on my screen was still there, still waiting, and I realized for the first time that this was not just about a marriage ending. It was about something I had never been allowed to see while I was still inside it. And before I could respond, the caller added one last sentence, quieter now, almost like a warning meant only for me. "If you want the truth, you need to start remembering things he made you forget." The next morning arrived in Manhattan like nothing had happened, like the city itself had no memory of what it witnessed behind closed apartment windows. And I remember sitting at the edge of my bed staring at my phone long after the calls had stopped, long after the unknown numbers had gone silent, as if silence itself was trying to convince me that I had imagined everything. But I had not, because the words were still inside me. "You do not know what he built to get here," and they clung to every thought I tried to form. And by the time I finally stood up and walked into the kitchen, I realized I was not thinking about the divorce anymore. I was thinking about Daniel as if he were a person I had never actually met, only observed from the safe distance of love, and that thought unsettled me more than anything else. And then around noon my phone rang again, this time showing a name I had not seen in years, Daniel Whitmore. And for a moment I just looked at it, letting it exist there like a wound reopening without touch, before I answered, and his voice came through immediately, controlled, familiar, too calm. "We need to finalize a few details," he said, as if we were closing a business transaction, not a life. And I said quietly, "There is nothing left to finalize." And there was a short pause before he responded, "Do not make this harder than it has to be, Emily. The firm is transitioning me into a new role. I need clarity on your expectations so there are no complications." And I almost laughed because he said it like I was a variable in his promotion, like my existence was something to be managed, and I said, "My expectation is that you remember I am not one of your contracts," and his tone shifted slightly, just enough to reveal irritation beneath the surface. "This is not personal," he said, and I closed my eyes because that was the same phrase he used the night he left, and I replied, "That is exactly the problem, Daniel. You have turned everything personal about me into something disposable." And there was another silence, heavier this time, before he said something that made my grip tighten on the phone. "I am offering you a clean financial settlement, more than most would get in your position." And I remember feeling something rise in my chest, not anger yet, but clarity, sharp and cold, and I said, "My position," and he continued as if I had not spoken. "You will be comfortable, Emily. You just need to sign and move forward." And that is when I heard it, the subtle shift, the assumption that I was still the version of myself who needed permission to survive, and I asked him, "Do you even hear yourself right now?" And he responded, "I am trying to protect both of us from unnecessary disruption." And that word, protect, landed strangely because it was the same word I used to use when I excused everything I did not understand about him, and I said softly, "You are not protecting me, Daniel. You are containing me." And he exhaled sharply, like patience was something I had wasted, and then he said, "Emily, I do not have time for emotional reinterpretations of the past." And I stood up from the counter because suddenly I could not stay still, and I walked to the window, looking out at Manhattan moving without me, and I said, "Then let me ask you something simple. Why did you really leave that night?" And for the first time his voice did not respond immediately. There was hesitation, a fraction of something unguarded, and then he said, "Because I reached a point where sentiment and progress could not exist in the same space." And I repeated his words slowly, "Sentiment and progress." And I felt the shape of that sentence in a way I did not like, because it sounded rehearsed, like something learned rather than felt. And I said, "So I was sentiment," and he did not correct me. And that silence told me more than anything he could have said. And then, just before he ended the call, he added, almost casually, "You should not let people fill your head with conspiracy theories about my career. It will only make this more painful for you." And that was when I understood something had already started moving behind him, something he was aware of but not in control of, because he was not defending himself anymore. He was warning me away from looking, and after the call ended, I stood there for a long time holding nothing but the echo of his voice, until my phone buzzed again, and this time it was a single message from the same unknown number as before, and it simply said, "He is trying to keep you from asking about Horizon Ledger." And I read it once, then again, because I had never heard that name in my life, and yet my body reacted to it before my mind did, like it was something already familiar but buried too deep to remember, and I sat down slowly. Because somewhere between Daniel's voice and that message, I realized I was no longer being told a story about a failed marriage. I was being guided away from something I was never supposed to see, and the last message that arrived before everything went quiet again was only 5 words long. "You used to know it." The message about Horizon Ledger stayed with me longer than anything Daniel had said, not because I understood it, but because I did not, and that absence of understanding felt deliberate, like standing in front of a locked door with the knowledge that I had once held the key, and yet no longer remembering where I put it, and for the first time since everything began collapsing around me, I found myself not reacting emotionally, but observing, as if part of me had stepped slightly outside of my own life to watch it unfold. And I remember walking across my apartment slowly, phone still in my hand, replaying the same phrase over and over, Horizon Ledger, Horizon Ledger, and then I opened my laptop again, this time not searching Daniel, but searching the name itself. And what appeared was almost nothing at first, just fragments buried in financial forums, deleted press mentions, archived references to a private restructuring initiative tied to multiple investment divisions in Manhattan, Boston, and San Francisco, and I leaned closer to the screen, my breathing slowing in a way that felt involuntary, because none of this matched the version of Daniel I thought I knew. Not the man who left a divorce agreement on a kitchen table, but something larger, something structured, something I had never been allowed to see. And then my phone rang again. But this time it was not unknown. It was a local New York number, and I answered without speaking, and a man's voice came through, steady, measured, the kind of voice that does not ask for permission to be heard. "Is this Emily Carter?" he said, and I replied, "Yes." And there was a pause, short but intentional, before he said, "My name is Thomas Reed. I am calling from the Manhattan Federal Financial Compliance Office," and I felt my body go still because that title did not belong in my living room, not in my quiet apartment, not in my private confusion. And I said, "I do not understand why you are calling me," and he responded, "Because your name appears in a set of internal references connected to a restructuring program your former husband is currently involved in." And I closed my eyes for a moment because hearing it said out loud made it real in a way the internet never had, and I asked quietly, "What kind of restructuring?" And he answered carefully, "One that involves asset consolidation across multiple private banking divisions." And then he added something that made the air in the room feel different, heavier, "And your name appears in early documentation related to its foundational phase." And I said nothing for a few seconds, because my mind was trying to reject the idea before it fully formed. And then I asked, "Why would my name be in anything like that?" And he said, "That is exactly what we are trying to understand." And then there was another voice in the background of his call, someone speaking softly but urgently, and he stepped away for a moment, and I stood there listening to the silence of a professional environment I was not part of, until he returned and said, "Miss Carter, there is someone here who specifically requested to speak with you." And I hesitated, and then I heard a second voice take over, and the moment I heard it, something inside me shifted because I recognized authority before I recognized identity, and the voice said, "Emily Carter, you do not know me, but I know you." And I whispered, "Who is this?" And he answered, "Captain Robert Hayes, retired United States Army Intelligence." And I remember gripping the edge of the counter because that combination of words did not belong in my kitchen either. And he continued, "Years ago, I worked on financial oversight coordination between federal contracting units and private sector banking compliance teams, and I have seen your name before, not recently but in connection with a closed advisory file." And I said, "You are mistaken. I have never been involved in anything like that." And there was a pause before he responded, "That is what makes this concerning." And I asked him, "Why are you calling me now?" And his voice lowered slightly, not threatening, but precise. "Because if Daniel Whitmore is where I believe he is inside Horizon Ledger, then your separation from him was not just personal, it was procedural." And I felt a strange coldness move through me because that word, procedural, suggested something organized, something intentional, and I said, "That makes no sense. I was just his wife." And he replied immediately, "That is what most people think until they are not." And I turned away from the window because I suddenly felt like the city outside was too large to contain what I was hearing. And he added, "I need you to listen carefully, Emily. Do not search for him directly, and do not confront him yet, because there is a layer to this structure that only becomes visible when you know where to look." And I asked him, "And what exactly am I supposed to be looking for?" And there was a brief silence before he said, "Your own involvement." And I froze because that sentence did not belong to me, and I said, "I have no involvement in anything." And he responded, "Then someone used your proximity to him in a way you were never meant to notice." And just as I was about to ask what that meant, I heard a knock at my apartment door, 3 soft knocks that did not match delivery services or neighbors. And I turned toward it slowly, not moving yet, because something in the timing felt wrong, like the conversation and the knock were part of the same moment, and Captain Hayes said quietly through the phone, "Do not open the door until you confirm who it is." And I stared at the door, unmoving, while another voice, this time from the hallway, called my name once, calmly, almost respectfully, "Emily Carter." And I felt my breath catch because that voice did not belong to Daniel, and it did not belong to anyone I knew, and yet it spoke my name like it had been expecting me. And then the phone line went silent for half a second before Captain Hayes said the words that changed the shape of everything I thought I was standing on. "Emily, someone has just found you faster than we expected." The knock at my door did not repeat, it did not escalate, it simply existed, like a decision already made on the other side of wood and metal. And I remember standing completely still with my phone still pressed against my ear, listening to the silence where Captain Hayes had been a second earlier, and then the line clicked dead, and for a moment there was nothing but my own breathing and the faint sound of the hallway outside, and then the voice came again, calm, controlled, closer now. "Emily Carter, I am not here to hurt you." And that sentence should have made me relax, but instead it made everything worse because certainty like that does not belong to strangers at your door. And I stepped backward slowly until my back touched the edge of the counter, and I whispered without meaning to, "Who are you?" And there was a pause before he answered, "My name is Victor Langston." And he did not add a title immediately, which somehow made it more unsettling, like he was choosing exactly how much of himself to reveal. And I heard papers shift outside, the soft sound of something being adjusted, and then he continued, "I used to oversee private financial transition compliance for Horizon Ledger." And that name again, heavier now, no longer just a phrase on a screen, but something that seemed to carry structure, hierarchy, weight, and I said, "I do not know what that is." And he replied, "That is because you were never supposed to." And there was something almost gentle in his tone, which frightened me more than aggression would have, and I asked, "Why are you here?" and he said, "Because Daniel Whitmore is no longer the center of what is happening, Emily, you are." And I felt my stomach tighten because I had heard variations of that sentence too many times in too many different voices over the last 48 hours, and I said, "I am nobody in this." And he responded immediately, "That is incorrect." And then there was a long silence, and I could feel him on the other side of the door, not moving away, not leaving, just waiting. And finally he said, "Open the door. I am going to show you something that will explain why your name appears in places it should not." And I shook my head even though he could not see me, and I said, "I am not opening anything until I understand what is going on." And that is when I heard a second set of footsteps in the hallway, slower, heavier, deliberate, and then a second voice, familiar in a way my mind rejected before I could process it, saying my name, "Emily." And I froze because I recognized Daniel's tone, but not his distance, not his confidence, something stripped away from it, and I walked toward the door without opening it yet, placing my hand on the wood, and I said, "Daniel, what is this?" And his voice came through, lower than I had ever heard it, "You are not supposed to be alone right now." And I whispered, "What are you talking about?" And he exhaled like he was deciding how much truth he was allowed to give me, and then he said, "They contacted you already, did they not?" And I felt my pulse rise because he did not ask if someone had, he knew. And I said, "There is a man outside my door who knows my name and keeps mentioning something called Horizon Ledger." And there was a pause, long enough that I could hear my own heartbeat in the silence, and then Daniel said something I did not expect, "Do not open the door for him." And I turned slightly, looking at the door like it had changed shape, and I said, "Why should I trust you now?" And his voice tightened just slightly, "Because if Victor Langston is there, then this has moved beyond you and me." And I asked, "Beyond us into what?" And he answered, "Into something that started long before you met me." And that sentence did not feel like manipulation. It felt like collapse, like something breaking apart in layers I could not see, and I pressed my forehead lightly against the door, trying to steady myself, and then I said, "You told me I was just part of your past. You were leaving behind." And there was a brief silence before he replied, "That is what I believed." And that single word, believed, changed the air in the room, because it suggested he had once been certain and was no longer. And outside the door I heard Victor's voice again, softer now, almost patient. "Emily, you were never just married to Daniel Whitmore. You were adjacent to a system that tracks influence through personal proximity." And I stepped back again, shaking my head, and I said, "I do not understand any of this." And Daniel said quickly through the phone, "You do not need to understand everything right now. Just do not open that door." And I asked him, "Then what am I supposed to do?" And he hesitated, and for the first time since this began, he sounded unsure. "You need to remember something I never told you about how I got my first position in Manhattan." And I closed my eyes because I had always assumed that story was simple. A promotion, timing, ambition, but now I could hear the gap in it. And Victor spoke again through the door. "Emily Carter, there is a document tied to your signature that appears in an early formation file for Horizon Ledger, and we are trying to determine whether it was placed there knowingly or used without your awareness." And I opened my eyes immediately. "My signature," I said aloud, and Daniel responded quickly, "Do not engage with him," but it was too late because something in me had already shifted, because a signature is not a rumor, it is not a theory, it is a fact tied to a moment, to a hand, to a choice. And I said quietly, "What document?" And Victor answered, "A preliminary authorization tied to financial routing permissions during the initial structuring phase." And I repeated it slowly because I did not understand the words, but I understood the implication, and I said, "That is impossible." And Daniel said sharply, "Emily, stop talking to him." But Victor interrupted calmly, "Ask him when he first met you." And the question landed differently, not as curiosity, but as structure collapsing into alignment. And I turned my head slightly toward the phone, and I said, "Daniel?" And there was a pause, and then he said, "That is not relevant." And in that moment I realized something subtle but irreversible, because if it was not relevant, then it had already been used somewhere else. And I looked back at the door and I whispered, "What did I sign?" And Victor replied, "That is what we are here to find out, because according to our records, you were present before your relationship with Daniel Whitmore ever began." And the room went completely still after that, not because nothing was happening, but because everything was shifting too quickly to hold on to. and Daniel said my name again. But this time it did not sound like a warning, it sounded like distance, and I realized I was standing in the center of something that no longer made sense from either side of the door, and Victor spoke one last time. Emily, the question is not whether you remember this, the question is whether you were ever allowed to. The moment Victor Langston finished speaking, something inside the hallway did not feel like a threat anymore. It felt like structure collapsing into visibility, and I stood there with my hand still pressed against the door, listening to 3 layers of silence at once. Daniel on the phone, Victor outside, and my own breathing slowing into something unfamiliar, and then Daniel spoke again, but this time his voice had lost its earlier control. Emily, do not listen to him. This is being taken out of context. And I remember blinking slowly because that was the first crack I had ever heard in his certainty, and I said quietly, "Then explain it to me," and there was a pause so long it felt like he was no longer deciding what to say, but what he could afford to say, and finally he answered, "There are things in corporate structuring that require temporary placeholder identities." And I repeated, "Placeholder identities," and Victor, still outside the door, responded calmly, "That is not accurate terminology for what we are seeing," and Daniel's tone sharpened immediately. "You have no jurisdiction to involve her in this," and Victor replied without raising his voice, "Mr. Whitmore, she is already in it." And I closed my eyes for a second because the way they were speaking about me did not feel like argument. It felt like 2 people describing different layers of the same map. And I opened my eyes and said, "Stop," and both of them went quiet. Not because I demanded it, but because I was no longer reacting like someone trapped in the middle. I was standing slightly outside of it, and I said into the phone, "Daniel, I am not going to argue anymore. I just want facts." And for a moment he said nothing. And then he exhaled and said, "Fine." And that single word felt like something falling open. And he continued, slower now. "When I first entered the New York division, I was brought in under a transitional advisory program tied to early-stage asset migration frameworks." And I interrupted softly, "That is not English to me." And he paused, then corrected himself. "I was recruited through a program that places individuals into emerging financial structures before formal designation." And Victor added immediately from the hallway, "Correct but incomplete," and Daniel snapped, "Stop speaking to her." And I lifted my hand slightly, even though neither of them could see it, and I said, "Let him talk." And there was silence on the phone, and then Victor said, "Emily Carter, what matters is not Daniel's entry point. What matters is that your identifier appears in the onboarding layer of Horizon Ledger's initial framework documentation." And I felt my stomach tighten, but I kept my voice steady. "My identifier," and Victor responded, "Yes. Your legal name appears as a referenced compliance anchor in pre-authorization structuring." And Daniel suddenly said loudly, "That is not what that means." And I turned toward the door, and for the first time I did not feel afraid of either of them. I felt something colder, clarity, and I said, "Then tell me what it means." And Daniel hesitated again, and I could hear something shifting in him, something between panic and calculation. And he said, "Emily, listen to me. You signed standard onboarding paperwork when we were establishing shared financial accounts." And I immediately answered, "We never had shared accounts beyond our joint checking." And Victor interrupted again, "That is consistent with what we are seeing. There are no consumer banking instruments involved in this record." And Daniel's voice rose slightly, "You are twisting this into something it is not." And I said, still calm, "Daniel, I am not twisting anything. I am trying to understand why 2 separate people are telling me my name appears in something I have never heard of." And that is when the silence on his end changed, not absence but realization. And he said slowly, "You do not remember." And I responded, "Remember what?" And he did not answer immediately, and for the first time since I had known him, he sounded uncertain. There was a period before we were officially together where I was working with external consultants, and Victor cut in, "That is the period we are referring to." And I said quietly, "Before we were together." And suddenly that phrase opened something inside my memory, not a clear image, but fragments. Daniel working late in a small co-working space in Boston before Manhattan, conversations I never fully entered, documents he closed when I walked near. And I said, "I met you in New York?" And Daniel answered quickly, "Yes," and Victor said at the same time, "That is where the relationship was formalized. not where it began. And I felt my breath slow because those two statements did not align, and I said, "Then where did it begin?" And there was a long pause, and Daniel finally said, "Emily, I need you to understand something. When I met you again in Manhattan, it was not the first time I had seen your name," and my grip tightened on the phone, and I said, "Again," and Victor spoke softly, "You were referenced in a due diligence report tied to early-stage recruitment profiling." And I stepped back from the door because the room suddenly felt smaller, and I said, "That does not make sense. I was working 2 jobs. I was nobody in finance." And Daniel responded quickly, almost defensively, "Exactly. That is why it should not be possible." And then, for the first time, he added something I did not expect, "Unless someone placed you there." And the hallway outside went completely silent after that sentence, and I asked, "Placed me where?" And Victor answered, "Inside the data architecture that predates Horizon Ledger's public formation." And I shook my head slowly and said, "I did not do anything." And Daniel said, softer now, "I never said you did." And that distinction landed heavily, because it meant my involvement did not require my awareness. And I asked, "Then what am I?" And no one answered immediately. And then Victor said, "That is what we are trying to determine, because right now, you are not just connected to Daniel Whitmore, you are positioned within the origin layer of a system he rose through." And I looked at the door again, and my hand slowly lowered from it, and I said quietly, "So my marriage was part of something I never agreed to." And Daniel responded immediately, "No," too quickly, too sharp, and then he corrected himself, "No, that is not what this is." But the hesitation that followed told me something else. And Victor added, "Emily, this is no longer about consent or relationship. This is about structure, and your name is inside it." And I stood there in complete silence for a moment, not because I had no questions, but because every answer I had been given was changing shape as soon as it arrived. And then Daniel said something I had never heard from him before, not control, not certainty, but almost fear. "Emily, do not let them isolate you with language you do not understand." And I said softly, "I am not isolated." And I turned my head slightly toward the door and added, "I am finally hearing the same story from 2 different people." And there was no response after that, just silence on both sides. And in that silence I realized something irreversible, that whatever Horizon Ledger was, it was not hidden in the future. It was already built into my past, and I whispered one last question into the quiet air. Then who decided I was part of it? And no one answered, but somewhere in that silence, I understood that the answer had already begun moving toward me. The silence after my last question did not stay empty for long. It began to fracture in layers, first through the door, then through the phone, then through something deeper that I could not name. And I remember standing in the middle of my apartment with both hands now lowered, no longer gripping anything, because it felt like everything I thought I was holding on to had already started slipping away, and Daniel's voice came through again. But this time it was different, not directed at me, but at someone else on his end of the call, sharp, controlled, almost desperate. "You were not supposed to escalate this without clearance." And I froze because that sentence did not belong to a husband speaking to his wife. It belonged to someone inside a system speaking to another part of the same system. And then Victor's voice outside the door answered calmly, "We did not escalate anything. We followed protocol when her identifier surfaced." And Daniel immediately responded, louder now, "Her identifier should not be active." And that word, active, made my skin tighten because it implied I was not being discussed as a person, but as something recorded, something indexed, and I took one step back instinctively as if distance could protect me from meaning, and I said quietly, "What is he talking about?" And there was a pause before Victor answered me directly through the door. "Emily Carter, there is disagreement internally about your classification." And Daniel cut in instantly, "There is no classification. She is not part of this." And Victor replied, "That is not what your historical submissions indicate." And I closed my eyes because the phrase, historical submissions, sounded like something far older than my marriage. And when I opened them again, I said, "Stop talking about me like I am a file." And for the first time, both voices went quiet at the same time. And in that shared silence, I heard something else. Faint movement in the hallway, more people arriving, footsteps that did not belong to Daniel or Victor alone. And then another voice entered, female, controlled, precise. "This is Agent Lillian Brooks. Federal Financial Oversight Unit, and I felt my breath stop, because now the door was no longer between me and one conversation. It was between me and a structure I did not recognize, and she continued, "We are not here for speculation. We are here for conflict containment." And I whispered without thinking, "Conflict between who?" And she answered immediately, "Between what your name is attached to and what your husband believes it should represent." And Daniel suddenly spoke again, but now he was no longer calm. "She is not to be involved in any federal review." And Agent Brooks responded evenly, "Mr. Whitmore, your objection is noted but irrelevant." And I heard something move sharply on the other side of the door, like paper being pulled too quickly. And Victor spoke again, but this time his voice was lower, strained. "Daniel, they already have her trace file." And Daniel snapped back, "You promised that would never surface." And Victor replied, "I did not promise that. I said it would remain dormant if nothing triggered reconciliation flags." And I repeated slowly, "Reconciliation flags." And suddenly Daniel said my name again, but not like before, this time like he was trying to anchor me to something familiar. "Emily, listen to me. You need to step away from the door." And I said, "No," quietly, not angry, just final, and that seemed to change something in him because his tone shifted again, softer, almost fractured. "You do not understand what they are going to show you." And Agent Brooks interrupted, "She already understands more than you think she does, Mr. Whitmore." And there was a pause. Then another voice joined, older, heavier, almost tired. "Open the file." And I heard a metallic click outside, like a briefcase latch, and I stepped forward without realizing it, pressing closer to the door again. And Daniel said quickly, "Do not do this here." And Victor replied, "It is already here." And then Agent Brooks spoke directly to me through the door. "Emily Carter, we are going to ask you a single question before anything else proceeds. Do you remember ever working, consulting, or signing any financial advisory consent forms prior to your relocation to Manhattan?" And I shook my head instinctively. "No." And there was a pause outside, a collective pause, and then Victor said quietly, "That is consistent." And Daniel immediately responded, "No, it is not. She just does not remember." And Agent Brooks said calmly, "Memory is not the only source of validation." And I felt my throat tighten because none of this felt like accusation anymore. It felt like calibration, like they were all trying to locate something inside me that they believed existed, even if I could not see it. And I said, "If you think I signed something, show me." And there was a moment of silence. Then I heard the briefcase open fully, and Agent Brooks said, "We are going to show you a redacted extract from Horizon Ledger Formation Indexing." And Daniel's voice cut through sharply, "No," but no one responded to him this time, and Victor said softly, almost to himself, "It is already approved." And then Agent Brooks continued, "Emily, when you entered Daniel Whitmore's life in Manhattan, your profile was already present in a preliminary risk alignment layer tied to his onboarding." And I whispered, "That is impossible." And she replied, "Then explain why your name appears in Boston pre-merge documentation dated 14 months before you say you met him." And the room tilted slightly in my perception because Boston was not where I met Daniel. Boston was where I lived before him, before anything. And I said, "I was working retail and night shifts. I was not in any system like that." And Daniel suddenly said, "That is what I told them." And I turned toward his voice through the door. "You told them." And he paused, and for the first time he did not correct himself immediately, and Victor said quietly, "Daniel was part of the initial validation layer." And Daniel snapped, "You are lying." And Agent Brooks responded, "We are reading from your submission record." And there was a long silence after that, and I could feel something shifting outside the door. Not confrontation anymore, but separation. And then Victor spoke again. But this time, not to me, not to Daniel, but to everyone. "The issue is no longer whether Emily Carter belongs in the structure. The issue is that removing her now destabilizes the origin chain." And Daniel said, almost breaking, "You are destroying me." And Victor replied, "No, Daniel, you are collapsing under inconsistency." And Agent Brooks added calmly, "This is what happens when origin dependencies are not disclosed at entry level." And I stood there listening as their voices began to overlap, Daniel arguing, Victor correcting, Agent Brooks documenting, each of them pulling in different directions, each of them exposing something the other did not want seen. And I realized something almost quietly devastating, that I had not been pulled into a conflict. I had been the point where their structure stopped agreeing with itself, and I said softly, almost to no one, "So what am I supposed to do now?" And for the first time, no one outside the door answered immediately, because they were no longer aligned enough to give me a single truth. And in that silence, I understood something I did not expect. I was no longer being contained. I was the reason they were breaking apart. The silence after everything broke open did not feel like an ending. It felt like space expanding too fast for anyone inside it to understand where the edges were. And I remember standing in my apartment with my hand still hovering near the door, but no longer needing to open it, because something had already shifted beyond that moment, beyond that threshold, and the voices outside were no longer arguing in a way that included me. They were unraveling into separate truths, overlapping, contradicting, collapsing into themselves, and then slowly, one by one, they stopped speaking altogether. Not because anything was resolved, but because nothing could hold together anymore. And I remember hearing footsteps retreat down the hallway, measured at first, then uneven, like people who no longer agreed on where they were going. And then there was only silence. Real silence this time. Not the kind filled with threat or anticipation, but the kind that arrives after something finally stops demanding your attention. And I did not move for a long time, because I realized I was no longer waiting for the next voice. And that absence felt like the first breath I had taken in hours. And when I finally stepped away from the door, it was not out of fear or defiance, but exhaustion that had softened into something quieter, something that felt almost like surrender without defeat. And I walked slowly back into my living room, where the city lights outside Manhattan were still unchanged, still indifferent. And I sat down not because I needed to think, but because I needed to stop holding the shape of everything that had just been forced into me. And for the first time since Daniel had left that night on the kitchen floor, I did not reach for answers. I did not open my laptop. I did not search for names that now felt like they belonged to someone else's life. And instead I just listened to my own breathing, steady but unfamiliar, as if I had been living in a version of myself that never paused long enough to notice it was breaking. And then my phone, which had been silent for what felt like hours, lit up again, but this time it was not unknown. Not official, not Daniel. It was a simple message from a number I did not recognize but now felt strangely familiar, and it said only, "You are not in danger right now." And I remember reading that sentence twice, because it did not feel like reassurance. It felt like confirmation of something I had already survived without realizing it, and I set the phone down slowly, as if sudden movement might disturb the fragile calm that had formed around me, and I looked around my apartment not as a place I was trapped in, but as a place I had returned to after being somewhere else I did not fully remember entering, and I realized I could not even recall the last time I had eaten, or slept properly, or spoken without measuring every word against someone else's expectation. And somewhere in that realization there was no revelation about systems or documents or structures. There was only a quiet awareness that I had been living at a speed that belonged to someone trying not to feel their own life. And I stood up again and walked to the kitchen without urgency, opened the cabinet, took out a glass, and filled it with water simply because it was something that required no interpretation, and I drank it slowly, letting the act exist without meaning beyond itself. And when I looked back toward the living room, I noticed something I had not seen before, a small framed photograph on the shelf that I had stopped noticing years ago, not of Daniel, not of anything recent, but of me and my mother standing outside a small house in upstate New York, both of us smiling in a way that did not look performed or defended, and I stared at it longer than I expected to, because I could not remember the last time I had looked at a version of myself that was not defined by reaction to something happening around her. And as I stood there, my phone buzzed again, but I did not rush to it. I let it remain where it was until the vibration stopped, and then I picked it up and saw another message from the same unknown number, and it said, "You do not need to decide anything tonight." And I sat back down, not because I was told to, but because I finally understood I did not have to stand in readiness anymore, and for the first time in what felt like years, I let the idea of not moving forward immediately exist without panic. And I thought about Daniel, not as a presence pulling me backward or forward, but as a person who had once shared a life with me that neither of us fully understood while we were inside it. And I thought about Victor, and Agent Brooks, and Captain Hayes, and all the voices that had tried to define me in the last days. And I realized, None of them had actually succeeded in touching the one thing I had lost the most, my ability to exist without being interpreted, and I leaned back into the couch, letting my shoulders settle for the first time since this began. And outside, Manhattan continued its endless motion, but inside my apartment, something had finally stopped moving against itself, and in that stillness, I understood something simple and unfamiliar, that survival was not always about uncovering what was hidden. Sometimes it was about remembering what had never been taken from you, even when everything else felt like it had been rewritten. And as the night deepened, I did not search for the truth. I simply stayed still long enough to feel what remained of myself without interruption. The morning after everything felt like it had been rewritten by silence rather than words, I woke up in my apartment in Manhattan, and for the first time in days there was no urgency waiting for me on the screen of my phone. No unknown numbers, no names. I did not recognize trying to define my life before I could understand it myself, and I just lay there for a moment staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant rhythm of the city below like it belonged to someone else, until I finally sat up and realized something strange. The fear was still there, but it was no longer leading me, and that small difference felt like the first real ground I had touched in a long time. And when I stepped into the kitchen, I noticed the light had shifted, softer now, almost forgiving, and I made coffee slowly, not because I needed it, but because I wanted to do something ordinary without it carrying meaning beyond itself. And as I stood there, I thought about Daniel. Not the version who walked away, and not the version who built himself into something I could not recognize, but the version who once sat across from me in small rooms with cheap coffee and talked about futures like they were shared. And I realized I did not feel anger anymore when I thought of him, only distance. And sometimes distance is the first form of peace. And somewhere in that same quiet, I understood that whatever structure I had been pulled into was no longer holding me in place, not because it had disappeared, but because I had stopped orbiting it. And later that afternoon, I received a message from Victor Langston, simple and unadorned, stating that your involvement has been formally cleared from active classification review. And for the first time, I did not feel relief as shock. I only felt stillness, because I understood that being removed from something you never asked to be part of is not victory, it is return. And then there was another message. This one from Daniel, but it was shorter than anything he had ever sent me before. Just one line saying, I was wrong about how I measured everything, and I stared at it for a long time without responding, not because I wanted to punish him, but because I no longer felt responsible for completing his sentences. And days passed like that, quietly, without escalation, without collapse, and I learned that silence after chaos is not emptiness, it is recalibration. And in that recalibration, I began to notice things I had ignored for years. The way sunlight hit the floor in the late afternoon, the sound of my own footsteps when I walked without rushing, the feeling of my own decisions not being immediately questioned by someone else's expectations. And I started meeting Rachel Monroe again, not to rebuild anything grand, but to rebuild normal things like sleep, meals, and boundaries. And she once looked at me across a small table in a cafe and said, "You are not recovering your life, you are finally entering it." And I remember nodding because for the first time that felt true, and Daniel's world, from what I later heard in fragments through mutual professional circles, did not collapse in dramatic fashion. It simply stopped expanding, promotions slowed, alliances shifted, and the name that once opened doors began to carry hesitation instead of certainty, not as punishment, but as consequence of instability that no longer had someone to balance it silently in the background, and I did not watch it fall, because I was no longer standing in its shadow. And one evening I met my mother for dinner in a small restaurant outside the city, and she looked at me for a long time before saying, "You look like you are finally resting inside your own life." And I realized she was right, because rest is not absence of movement, it is absence of internal conflict. And as I drove back that night, I thought about something simple that I had not understood before, that truth does not always arrive as revelation. Sometimes it arrives as subtraction and the removal of everything that is not yours. And for those of you listening who may still feel caught in stories that are trying to define you faster than you can understand them, I want to say this without asking you to be strong, without asking you to be anything other than honest with yourself. There are moments when walking away is not an ending but a return to your own perception of reality. And I am grateful, truly grateful, if you are here with me in this moment, because it means you are still listening for yourself beneath everything else, And I want to thank you for staying with this story, not because it is mine, but because it might echo something of yours. And if you feel comfortable, I would love to hear where you are in the world and what time it is for you right now, not as data, but as a reminder that none of us are alone in these pauses between what breaks and what rebuilds. And if this story has found a place in you, I would be grateful if you like this video, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments, not for the sake of the channel, but because shared understanding makes distance smaller. And if there is one thing I have learned through everything that happened, it is this. Your value was never meant to be negotiated inside someone else's system. It was always meant to be recognized inside your own awareness. And I will end this by saying thank you, not as closure, but as acknowledgement, because sometimes the most powerful ending is simply being able to say, I am still here, and I understand myself a little more than I did before.